Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and welcome to this new angle. So today, for something a little bit different and a little bit fun, I thought I would harken back to the Do I Have This Book tag challenge. And this challenge was done by many people such that I can't find the original creator. I will link the blog post that I found in order to find all of the questions down below. But essentially, in this tag, I had to go through my shelves and find as many books as possible that fit certain categories. Now, I am going to be timing myself. I'm going to put a timer on my phone and seeing how quickly I can do this. I'm also going to try to pull only from these shelves behind me, as many of you are curious about my bookshelf organization. So these are my fiction shelves, and then my nonfiction comes around the corner here. Occasionally I may have to vault over my bed, which is right here, to reach my usual filming bookcase. But I'm going to try not to as much as I can, because the other part of the challenge that I am setting myself is to try and pull books that I haven't talked about as much on this channel. So, with all of those challenges in mind, maybe too ambitious, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to set my stopwatch starting now. All right, do you have a book with deckled edges? I must have tons. Let's see. Yes. Do you have a book with 3 or more people on the cover? Yes. Yes. Do you have a book based on another fictional story? Which shall I choose? I'm going to go with that one. Do you have a book with a title 10 letters long? Coming back to that one. Next, do you have a book with a title that starts and ends with the same letter? Got it. Do you have a mass market paperback book? I do have a couple. I will pull that one. Do you have a book by an author using a pen name? I don't think I do on these shelves, so I'm going to come back to it. Do you have a book with the character's name in the title? Certainly. Come here. Stay. Okay. Do you have a book with 2 maps in it? Book with 2 maps. Let's see. Yes. Do you have a book that was turned into a TV show? Well, some of those were, but let's find a different one. Huh. Going with 2 for that one. Do you have a book written by someone who was originally famous for something else? Yes. Do you have a book with a clock on the cover?
Maybe.
Yes. Which means, no. Do you have a poetry book? Yes. Do you have a book with an award stamp on it? Ha! Got it. Do you have a book written by an author with the same initials as you? So for me, that's HS. No. Do you have a book of short stories? Yes. Do you have a book that is between 500 and 510 pages? No idea. Do you have a book that was turned into a film? A film. Do you have a graphic novel? Yes. Please stay up. Graphic novel. Do you have a book written by 2 or more authors? Yes. Done. All right, so that was 8 minutes and 28 seconds. Skipping 3 and 1 question that I definitely know the answer is no. So, this is my final stack. Let me join you in my usual filming corner, and I'll tell you all about them. Welcome back. All right, so the first question was, do you have a book with deckled edges? I do have many, even though I personally am not a fan of them. I'm a really tactile person, and I love just running my fingers over the edges of pages. When you have deckled edges, it makes it really hard to do that. I know, I sound like a complete child, but there we are. So the book that I chose that has deckled edges is The Marlowe Papers by Roz Barber. And this was really fascinating. It is a book told in verse, I believe. Yes. It's a book told in verse from the perspective of Christopher Marlowe, the playwright, after he has faked his own death and fled abroad, telling the story of how he reached this point. It is truly wonderful. I'm not a big fan of the conspiracy theory that Marlowe actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, even though that is the point of view that Roz Barber takes. But the way this is written is so compelling that I loved it anyway. The next question was, do you have a book with 3 or more people on the cover? And for that, I chose Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This is a true edition in that it has both Little Women and Good Wives all bound together. And you can see it has the 4 March sisters, or what are supposed to be the 4 March sisters, on the cover. Question 3 was, do you have a book based on another fictional story? And I have many, again, but for this I chose The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which is based on the Iliad by Homer. This has been making the rounds on BookTube, so I'm sure you've heard of it by this point. But in brief, it is the story of Achilles as seen through the eyes of his friend Patroclus, and Madeline Miller imagines what it would have been like for these 2 men growing up together, facing the Trojan War, and developing feelings for one another. It was so beautiful. I flew through it and I absolutely adored it. Do you have a book with a title 10 letters long? I couldn't find any on my shelves. I found some that were over, some that were under, but I haven't managed to find one that is exactly 10. Do you have a book that starts and ends with the same letter? And yes, I do. And that book is The Rose and the Dagger by Renée Ahdieh. And yes, this counts because you never file under the when you are filing alphabetically. So Rose and Dagger begin and end with the same letter. This is the sequel to The Wrath and the Dawn, which is a retelling of 1001 Arabian Nights, specifically the tale of Scheherazade, and you dive deeply into why Scheherazade volunteers to become the Sultan's next bride, as well as why the Sultan keeps killing all of his wives. I thought it was very well done, very compelling, and I liked the sequel very much too. Do you have a mass market paperback? I have a couple, not many, but I do own this edition of Christie by Catherine Marshall, which is a wonderful book about a young woman named Christie Huddleston, who leaves her home in the city to travel to the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina to become a teacher as part of a mission group. And it is a really heartwarming story about the community that she meets there and that she becomes a part of, and in addition, a love triangle. It is really, really wonderful. Next, do you have a book by an author using a pen name? And I don't think I do because I am limited to these shelves. In the other room, I do, however, have my Jane Austen Mysteries series by Stephanie Barron, which is a pen name. Her real name is in fact Francine Matthews. Next is, do you have a book with a character's name in the title? And for that I chose The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling by Henry Fielding. This is a doorstopper, but it is a classic of 18th century literature. It is very funny, very episodic in nature, so you can pick it up and come back to it. It tells the story of Tom Jones, who is a foundling and adopted into this family, and he eventually develops feelings for the girl next door, but always falls victim to vice and winds up in the most terrible scrapes, such that it takes him all this time to finally get out of all of those scrapes and be in a position to finally capture Sophia's heart. Well, he's already captured her heart, but in order to settle down and marry her properly. If you're feeling intimidated by this, I would recommend watching the film first with Albert Finney from the 1960s, I believe. Do you have a book with 2 maps in it? Yes, I do, and that is A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin, which is, of course, the 5th book in the Game of Thrones series. And if I open it up here, there is a map of the north on the one side and the south on the other. So I am counting that as 2 maps. Next, do you have a book that was turned into a TV show? And yes, I do, and that is Northern Lights, or The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. This is the British edition, which I saved from my children's literature class when I studied in England. His Dark Materials, the newer television show, is wonderful. I am currently in the middle of season 2, and my friend and I are both in agreement, and Jonathan loves these books even more than I do, that the show might even be a little bit better than the books, because it is able to take all of Pullman's ideas and streamline them so that they are far more clear and comprehensible, which I'm really enjoying. Next, do you have a book written by someone who is originally famous for something else? And that is How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb, who, if I turn it around, there he is as an adult. You might recognize from the television shows That Mitchell and Webb Look, or Peep Show, or indeed many other productions that he has been in since. He's been in a couple of stage productions. And he wrote this book both as partly autobiography and partly looking at how toxic masculinity has affected him personally and his life. And I really enjoyed it. I found it really fascinating. Next, do you have a book with a clock on the cover? And I do. And that is my copy of The Shadow in the North by Philip Pullman. And there's the clock right there, which is the sequel to The Ruby in the Smoke in his Sally Lockhart series, which is about Sally Lockhart, who's a young woman in Victorian London who begins her own detective agency. These are really wonderful. I actually prefer these books to the Golden Compass series. Next, do you have a poetry book? And yes, I have a couple books of straight poetry, but I also love The Ode Less Traveled by Stephen Fry. which is a book in which Stephen Fry teaches you about a variety of styles of poetry, and of course gives you examples of that style of poetry throughout, breaks it down for you bit by bit, and then at the end of each chapter gives you an exercise so you can try it for yourself. It starts all the way from various kinds of meters to various styles of poetry. I really enjoyed this, and I would highly recommend it to everybody, especially if you are an English student. Do you have a book with an award stamp on it? And yes, I do. That is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, which won the Newbery Medal here in the US. I read this 3 years ago on vacation and sped through it, but not just because it's a children's book. It is genuinely compelling. And it is the story of Bod, which is short for Nobody, who is a boy whose parents are murdered right at the beginning of the book, so prepare yourself for that. And he is taken in by a community of ghosts who live in the cemetery across the road. And all of the things that he has to learn and all of the differences that he has to deal with as he grows up because of his unique circumstances. But also the fact that his parents' killer is still lurking out there and is looking for him. It was so wonderfully done. I love all of Neil Gaiman's books, so I would highly recommend this one. I do not have a book from an author with the same initials as me. I have no authors with the initials HS anywhere on my shelves. I do, however, have a book of short stories, and it is Jane Austen Made Me Do It, which was edited by Laurel Ann Mattress, who's a wonderful author about Jane Austen in and of herself, but it also features stories from Adriana Trigiani, Amanda Grange, Stephanie Barron, Siri James, Laurie Vieira Riegler, and many, many more, Pamela Aden. And some of these stories reimagine parts of Austen's novels or are extensions of her novels, but others completely reimagine those same characters in modern day, such as Mr. Darcy bringing a lawsuit against all of the Pride and Prejudice spin-off writers. They are very funny, very insightful, and I truly love this collection. I could not find a book that is exactly between 500 and 510 pages. I could have sworn that one of the Poldark books was 508 pages, but I couldn't find it. For a book that was turned into a film, I have many on my shelves, but the one I chose was The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. I actually have a large collection of Philippa Gregory novels, and I realize that they're not always of the best literary merit. They are very smutty, so people tend to turn up their noses at them. But I thought The Other Boleyn Girl was wonderful and much better done than the film because it acknowledged that there are gaps in what we know and what we don't know about Anne Boleyn. This is, of course, being told from her sister Mary's perspective. But Anne Boleyn was accused of having slept with her brother George. We will never know whether or not that is true. And I loved the way Philippa Gregory dealt with it by having Mary leave the room as Anne and George were talking it over and deciding what to do. So that holds true to history. We will never know whether or not it actually happened. Whereas in the film, they made a definitive choice and the camera stayed in the room with Anne and George, and they made a definitive choice about whether or not it happened. And that was a moment that really struck me, even at 15 or 16. I do indeed have a couple of graphic novels, not very many, but the one on these sets of shelves is Bloodlust and Bonnets by Emily McGovern, which is a wonderful, hilarious ride. As you can probably tell from the cover, it does take place during the Regency era, featuring Lord Byron, and her sense of humor is utterly fabulous. And she works in Regency culture as well as the Gothic that was on the rise, and there are actually vampires, but she does it with such a tongue-in-cheek style. If you're familiar with the comic My Life as a Background Slytherin, I would highly recommend those because they are very funny in and of themselves. But this is the same author, just dealing with the Regency period, which I adore. And finally, again, I have a couple of books written by 2 or more authors, but the one I chose was I, Judas by Taylor Caldwell and Jess Stern, which is the story of the passion of Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, his ministry, all of that, but through the eyes of Judas, who has been vilified for thousands of years, but I've always felt has gotten the rough end of the deal, because if you follow the theory that this was God's plan for Jesus to die for our sins, somebody had to turn him over in order to start that ball rolling. So in a way, Judas was helping fulfill that plan. But in any case, this does not make Judas out to be a perfect goody two-shoes. He is flawed because he is human, but it helps to examine him as a full character, which I really appreciated. So there you have it. That was my 8-minute stack of 16 books, which I think was pretty good going considering. Let me know in the comments down below if you have more questions about these books, if you are excited to do them, if you would also like to resurrect this tag, or if you have other recommendations for me. Please let me know in the comments down below. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.